Morning, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you guys had a good day yesterday. I hope you have your cup of Joe. So today, well, first, side note, but very important. I'm really becoming attached already to this time together in the mornings. It's so peaceful, and it's wonderful to have this food for thought. So I appreciate you guys being here with me. Okay, so yesterday, as you remember, we moved from a consideration of what a wise man is and what the highest truths are to a discussion on the approach of the book itself, which you remember is him saying, look, kind of what I said to you, if I want to try to talk about these truths with the Jews, then we have the Old Testament in common, and that works because they believe the Old Testament. If I want to talk about these truths and kind of wrestle them out and sort them out, then for Christians or Orthodox or Catholics, then we can all use the New Testament as well. But if we don't have that in common, then we just should rely on reason so that we can talk about these things. So now he's going to go from from this idea of reason, that this title of this next chapter is On the Way in Which Divine Truth is to be Made Known. And you'll see he kind of tries to figure out, like, from a natural reason perspective, does it even make sense for God to reveal truth? Or and also, can we even know anything about God with our natural reason? So, without further ado, welcome to Cup of Jonah. Chapter 3, On the Way in Which Divine Truth is to be Made Known. The way of making truth known is not always the same, and as the philosopher has very well said, it belongs to an educated man to seek such certitude in each thing as the nature of that thing allows. The remark is also introduced by Boethius. Pin in Boethius, I want to come back to that. He's got one of the most beautiful definitions of God, but we'll get back. We can get back to that. But since such is the case, we must first show that what way is open to us in order that we may make known the truth which is our object. In old scholastic terminology, when you talk about something as the object of a science or of a discussion, it's talking about we would call it the subject. What is in English today, we would call it the subject, the subject of discourse, right? It's a little bit nuanced difference there from our perspective. It can be a little confusing. There's a twofold mode of truth in what we profess about God. Some truths about God exceed all the ability of human reason, such as the truth that God is triune. But there are some truths which the natural reason also is able to reach, such are that God exists, that he is one, and the like. In fact, such truths about God have been proved demonstratively by the philosophers, guided by the light of natural reason. You guys have heard me talk a lot about Aristotle as the pinnacle point of this. That there are certain truths about God that totally surpass man's ability appears with the greatest evidence, since indeed the principle of all knowledge that the reason perceives about something is the understanding of the very substance of that being. According to Aristotle, what a thing is the principle of demonstration. He talks about that in Posterior Analytics. It is necessary that the way in which we understand the substance of a thing determines the way in which we know what belongs to it, or what its characteristics are, etc. Hence, if the human intellect comprehends the substance of some thing, for example, that of a stone or of a triangle, no intelligible characteristic belonging to that thing surpasses the grasp of human reason. But this thing does not happen to us in the case of God, for the human intellect is not able to reach a comprehension of the divine substance through its natural power. For according to its manner of knowing in the present life, the intellect depends on sense for the origin of knowledge. And so those things that do not fall under the senses cannot be grasped by the human intellect, except insofar as knowledge of them is gathered from sensible things. Now, sensible things cannot lead the human intellect to the point of seeing in them the nature of the divine substance. For sensible things are effects that fall short of the power of their cause. Yet, beginning with sensible things, our intellect is led to the point of knowing about God that he exists, and other such characteristics that must be attributed to the first principle. There are consequently some intelligible truths about God that are open to the human reason, but there are others that absolutely surpass its power. We may easily see the same point from the gradation of intellects. Consider the case of two persons of whom one has a more penetrating grasp of a thing by his intellect than does the other. He who has the superior intellect understands many things that the other cannot grasp at all. Such is the case with a very simple person who cannot at all grasp the subtle speculations of philosophy. But the intellect of an angel surpasses the human intellect much more than the intellect of the greatest philosopher surpasses the intellect of the most uncultivated simple person. For the distance between the best philosopher and a simple person is contained within the limits of the human species, which the angelic intellect surpasses. For the angel knows God on the basis of a more noble effect than does man, and this by as much as the substance of an angel, through which the angel in his natural knowledge is led to the knowledge of God, is nobler than sensible things, and even than the soul itself, through which the human intellect mounts to the knowledge of God. The divine intellect surpasses the angelic intellect much more than the angelic intellect surpasses the human. For divine intellect is in its capacity equal to its substance, and therefore it understands fully what it is, including all its intelligible attributes. But by this natural knowledge, the angel does not know what God is, since the substance of the angel, through which he is led to the knowledge of God, is an effect that is not equal to the power of its cause. Hence, the angel is not able, by means of his natural knowledge, to grasp all the things that God understands in himself, nor is the human reason sufficient to grasp all the things that the angel understands through his own natural power. Just as, therefore, it would be the height of folly for a simple person to assert that what a philosopher proposes is false, on the ground that he himself cannot understand it, so, and even more so, it is the acme of stupidity for a man to suspect as false what is divinely revealed through the ministry of angels, simply because it cannot be investigated by reason. The same thing, moreover, appears quite clearly from the defect that we experience every day in our knowledge of things. We do not know a great many of the properties of sensible things, and in most cases, we are not able to discover fully the natures of those properties that we apprehend by the sense. Much more is it the case, therefore, that human reason is not equal to the task of investigating all the intelligible characteristics of that most excellent substance. The remark of Aristotle likewise agrees with this conclusion. He says that, quote, our intellect is related to the prime beings, which are most evident in their natures, as the eye of an owl is related to the sun. Sacred Scripture also gives testimony to this truth. We read in Job, peradventure thou wilt comprehend the steps of God, and wilt find out the Almighty perfectly. And again, quote, behold, God is great, exceeding our knowledge, end quote. And St. Paul, we know in part. We should not therefore immediately reject as false, following the opinion of the Manichaeans and many unbelievers, that everything said about God, even though it cannot be investigated by reason. Okay, so what's neat here is this whole parallel. Good morning, Amy. Glad you made it on time. This whole concept of the gradation of intellects, where he underlines that it's impossible for even within the human race, for those of lesser ability who can't define a woman, for example, to tell someone who understands that God is one and created all things, and that can be understood with certainty from just the powers of the divine of the human intellect, right? So just like for someone who can't define a simple thing, you can't. It's folly for us to reject truths that are given by an intellect even more powerful than ours. So it's reasonable to understand and accept that some things are beyond our capacity and can be revealed. And just because they're beyond our capacity doesn't mean they're false, right? So that's kind of the groundwork of why revelation is a thing and why it's not unreasonable that it's a thing. In the posterior analytics, which Aristotle, which Thomas references here. So in the prior analytics is where is the book in which Aristotle basically unfolds and unpacks the truth about, or kind of just how the bare mechanics, like the wire mechanics of syllogisms and arguments, right? How do you put together a rational argument to know the conclusions with certainty? And that's where he unfolds also like the different fallacies and things like that. So basically in Aristotle's organon, it's part of his work on logic, which he calls the organon, the toolbox for what he defines logic as the art of reasoning well. So if like we said the other day, that the book on the paper on Dante Sense, or on being in essence, that Thomas wrote, he talks about a small error in the beginning results in large error in the end. So the books on the analytics, prior and posterior, basically is just like, okay, this is how we do this art of reasoning, and this is how we do it well, right? Now, what's interesting is in posterior analytics, which is referenced here, Aristotle also talks about the art of definition. So there's 3 acts of the intellect that go into logical discourse. The art of definition, or the art of naming and understand and perceiving individual things that we, rock, tree, wisdom, understanding, right? And everything in between. So once you have definitions and clear perception of what you mean by a term, then the second act of the intellect is the art of statement. So all dogs are animals. That's a statement. So we can evaluate the truth or the falsity of a statement. But then we can also, the third act of the intellect is stringing those statements together to come to necessary certain conclusions. So you can see how each of the acts of the intellect build one upon the other. So, so that's kind of the framework that he's referencing. But what's interesting is he said that we, with our human intellects, we don't even understand the complete definitions of things. For example, that's a great comment, Ted. I'll comment on that in a second. But what's very interesting about this is to get a perfect definition of the nature of a thing, we can only give what's called the specific difference. So you have a genus and then the specific difference. That's what you need for a definition. So men are rational animals. That's what separates us. That's the specific difference between humanity from men and all other animals, right? But what's the specific difference of a honeybee? How is it specifically? How is it different? Exactly. We don't even know, right? So this is really interesting because it shows that even interacting with the natural world, there are things we don't understand. Very simply and obviously, we don't even understand how the universe or our realm works. We don't understand. That's why the art of science is the lost art, but anyways, that's a whole other conversation. But so it's really important when we're trying to understand and sort out and ponder the truths of the divine to recognize our own limits of our mind. If we could comprehend, it was falsely attributed to Shakespeare, who was a great philosopher, by the way. There's Aristotelian thoughts and themes behind a lot of his between a lot of underneath a lot of the ideas that he conveys throughout his work. So it's really fascinating. But he says, I think it was actually someone else, Roberts or something, somebody contemporary to him. But the statement is, a man's reach out extends his grasp. So I can touch things, so I can perceive certain things or ponder certain things. I can feel them, I can touch them intellectually, but without grasping them. So I can touch something, but I have to be closer to it to actually grab a hold of it. Does that make sense? So it's a very physical argument. But so we can perceive and understand things about a lot more than we can actually grasp or fully understand the natures of those things, right? We experience that every day. Yes, the great chapter. It also shows, as Ted says, it also shows how far we've fallen. People used to strive to be intellects and look at deep thought and reasoning as an art. Today, kids have litter boxes in school bathrooms. It's true. It's true. The decline of Western civilization has been incredible and atrocious. That's true. But here we are, providing a counter stream to that, a counter movement there in our little way, pondering these great truths. So it's really important, as he even in the very opening lines of yesterday's reading, he said, look, I'm trying to talk about wisdom and it's way beyond my capacity. Now he's one of the greatest minds that has ever walked the earth. And yet he says, this is beyond his capacity, a lot of these things to discuss, but he'll do it to the best of his ability. So that's how I feel here as well. I feel like this is all above and beyond our capacity as men and women, of course. I mean men in the old sense, in the generic sense, literally the genus, an irrational animal. Anyways, so that's really important. The reference to the Manichaeans at the end is also very important. It's one of the major errors of our day. So the Manichaeans, if you guys are familiar, I pulled this out of the library here, my library, the Confessions of St. Augustine. So St. Augustine wrestled with this concept of this Manichaean heresy. What was Manichaeanism? Okay, so Manichaeism basically believed that the entire universe was dualistic, not in the sense that Vince does. Okay, Vince has an accurate interpretation, a much more accurate interpretation than the Manichaean. So the Manichaean heresy was basically that all of reality, there was kind of like the yin and the yang is a good way to imagine it, right? Where there's two equal and eternal principles of good and evil. And evil is just as powerful as good is, and they're equal, and they kind of rival for each other, and they're together responsible for all that follows, all that flows from that. Now, we know that's not true just from natural reason, without any revelation, because there has to be one principle of all things. Good philosophy teaches us this. So that's important. So, but what's interesting is the Manichaeans also believed that matter itself was evil, but that's part of our nature. We were made this way. That means that it can't be bad. It's how we were made. So now it is true that our souls sort of outlive the body, but even Aristotle was like, what happens after that? I don't know. So without revelation of things beyond our capacity, here's another perfect example of it. He didn't know the answer. So you're left with either thinking it must be reincarnation of some kind or resurrection, as Scripture has revealed to us, right? So we can touch on that later at some point. I'm sure we will in these volumes here. But there's a real problem with reincarnation as a concept, philosophically. But so it's interesting. So just to kind of recap, he takes us through and he says, okay, well, look, we can't even say that all human intellects have the same capacity. So for those spiritual beings that we call angels, you can also say fallen angels have the same intellectual capacity that far surpasses men. If we can recognize limits within our own species and gradations of intellectual prowess, so to speak, then it's not unreasonable then to also understand and conclude that those who have a much more direct and piercing mode of knowledge, that is, these spiritual entities we know have immediate knowledge of the natural world and of things, but they can also, from their natures, which are higher than ours because they're not tied to matter, and they don't filter all of their information through the senses, that those higher beings still can't fully comprehend. Their reach extends beyond their grasp as well when it comes to the divine. So this first uncaused cause, because the effect can't know fully the cause, right? The effect that's not equal to. Anyway, so very, very interesting. And it's kind of cool how he's bringing in posterior analytics. He brought in reference Nicomachean ethics of Aristotle. So he's bringing in all these works to show that our mode is limited. Our mode of knowledge is limited. We can't even give a perfect definition of a majority of the things that we understand. But now we'll see more of this down the road. But there's what he calls the different roads to knowledge. St. Thomas, the universal road, the common road, and the natural road. So this is the natural road for going from, because it's according to our nature, how we interact with and understand the world around us is through the limits of our nature, or the road, the path that our nature has set out to us, which is through sense knowledge, which in our day and age, it's worth noting that our sense knowledge is becoming dubious, perhaps for the first time in history. I know that's a big statement, but think about it. With AI, we can't even now, we used to be able to pull up a documentary or a video on YouTube where we could see something happening and reflect on it and reason out what that means. Now, in a gaslighting fashion, we don't even know if what we're seeing or witnessing is true. We don't know if it's real or not. So now our sense knowledge, for the first time in a long time, perhaps ever, is now being also called into question. Now, of course, there's always been people with vivid imaginations or without a full grasp on reality who don't have like a grounded perception of our reality. And so that inhibits their ability to grasp at higher truths as well, because they're perceiving things, or their mind is playing tricks on them, so they don't really fully know what's real and what's not, right? We know about these different issues mentally and psychologically, but those are exceptions, right? So for all of us, we get all of our knowledge from the senses, and then from the good art of reasoning, well executed, that's what I mean by good, we're able to discern, deduce, and extrapolate and infer more truth. And that's how we can come to a knowledge of the divine. But we're only scratching the surface. So that's why, as he argues in this chapter, that's why it's so important for us to recognize that it's appropriate for there to be revealed truths. Now, as we'll see later, one of the things he talks about as well is that because these truths are so elevated, like, for example, most of us today, many of us, probably all of us, can't even hold a candle to Aristotle's perception and accurate analysis of things. And that these highest truths about the divine that are accessible by reason are only accessible to a relatively few people who have the time to reflect on it, right? It's because the philosopher, it was considered a life of leisure, because everywhere else, you're toiling in the fields to survive a lot. It's not now we're in the 9 to 5, all that often. So unless you've had the time to really reflect on these things and come to these truths yourself, it's fitting that it be revealed, because otherwise most people wouldn't get there. We don't have the time, right? Another reason why I love this time together in the mornings that we have now, because this kind of gives us the time to plant the seeds for our reflection and growth intellectually. So it's really fun, really wonderful. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that reading there? Yeah, no, it's definitely impressive in a negative sense how, even just simple logic is not taught in schools. That's a sad thing. But it's beautiful, and there's one other quote from Aristotle that I wanted to share. It just slipped my mind. If it doesn't come back, I'll mention it tomorrow. But yeah, so we can't slip into the error of the Manichaeans by rejecting everything that we can't figure out ourselves, and by giving evil too much power, by seeing it as like our physicality as a negative thing. Our physicality and the way that we learn is by nature designed to be through our senses. So Ted says, I will be dwelling on this chapter all day. Kind of makes me want to be better, maybe. I know, it's true. It is so true. In fact, I had this experience in the monastery. I remember sitting at this table, and it was one of those few times that we were able to talk to each other, because we were silent a vast majority of the time, as you know. So I remember sitting there. So as a young man, before I entered the monastery, a lot of my time was spent playing video games. I love to play Madden. I love different adventure games and stuff like that. It was one of the ways in which I bonded with my brother, which I loved that aspect of it, and I wouldn't trade that aspect of it for anything. But I remember sitting there and hearing these guys years younger than I saying, "Oh, oh, you remember in Merchant of Venice, Shakespeare said XYZ. I love the nuance there," or whatever. And then, oh, well, who's your favorite poet? And I remember, like, at that point, I really didn't have much exposure to those things, or hadn't put the time in personally to understand and appreciate poetry. So it was very humbling for me, because I realized that I had squandered many days of my youth, so to speak, in pursuits that, like, okay, so yeah, I had that record in Madden, cool. Where'd it go? How did it serve me? And so that's when I started to get really a lot more serious about trying to form my mind and develop my mind, because I felt I was shown in a very gentle, indirect way. I was shown how much I didn't know that was worth knowing, right? So beautiful stuff. But if you haven't read this, Confessions of St. Augustine, you must. I strongly encourage, because it's so beautiful, because it's Confessions. It's not like a confession like, oh, I did this, I did that. No. But it's Confessions, meaning it's like his life story, but it's a story of his soul finding truth and beauty. That line that probably is everyone's heard, or most have heard, late have I loved you, O beauty ever ancient, ever new. He was in kind of like just bursts out in prayer all throughout this book, and he's just referring to the God above, and he's like, man, if I had known how beautiful pondering your ways are, and pondering you and getting to know you, late have I loved you. So I felt that so much in my life, still feel that way. But it's such a beautiful book. And in fact, maybe after we finish book 1 of this, we'll take a break before we go to book 2, and we'll read this together. I think it would be time well spent. Yeah, Ted, smooth way to bring up my Madden record. I couldn't resist. No, no. So, yeah. So, in summary, and then as a teaser going forward to tomorrow, where the chapter heading is that the truth about God to which natural reason reaches is fittingly proposed to men for belief. And this is kind of what I alluded to before, right? Few men over a great amount of time would actually arrive at these truths, even though they're accessible by reason, because of the subtlety and the excellence of those truths. It requires a lot of time of reflection and meditation and philosophizing, right? So, because of the majority of men don't have the time to be able to get there, it makes sense that those truths would also be part of revelation, or those would be revealed. So, lots to think about today. We're at about 30 minutes now, and again, I appreciate you guys. Don't forget, so we're on Spotify. Every episode within a half hour of the episode airing, you can go listen to the episode on Spotify. phoneboothpodcast.substack.com. Subscribe, free. Then you'll get notifications when we go live here. You'll also get notifications for a lot of the other podcasts in the Phone Booth podcast group. But I also want to tease a trailer for this evening. I'm going live with one of my favorite human beings. His name is Dominic. He wrote a book called Divine Poetry. Now, we've heard the phrase, history rhymes. It doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, right? This book, Divine Poetry by Dominic, goes through and talks about how the Old Testament rhymes with the New, and how all of Old Testament history before Christ, all of BC, so to speak, rhymes with AD, and how the parallels so beautifully mirror each other, or play kind of these different themes that are played with throughout history. And it's such a beautiful reflection. And this man is one of the most genuine, humble, but intelligent men that you have yet to meet. And it'll be my honor to introduce him to you guys this evening. So please tune in, 7 p.m. EST. We're going live with Dominic this evening to talk about divine poetry. So I look forward to seeing you then. Much love. Until tomorrow, enjoy your cup of Jonah.